So, today I want to talk about microplastics and forever chemicals in Colorado's water supply. Water is life. And as we see climate change affect the planet more and more, we can see that the majority of its impact comes down to water. Aridification, flooding, and rising temperatures are all examples of types of climate disasters that lead to a decrease in the amount of clean water that's available across the globe. While these are the direct result of this human created disaster that is climate change and climate crisis, there are other ways that we've been poisoning the precious life giving water that allows us to live. PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, are ending up in water supplies across the globe. And we're finding that more and more people are discovering microplastics in places where they genuinely don't belong. In the food we eat, in the water we drink, and even in our own blood. So today, I want to examine what's going on in Colorado as a microcosm of what's going on globally, especially as Colorado is testing what a lot of other places may be ignoring. So, to start off with, we have that more than 100 drinking water sources across Colorado, ranging from cities and counties to elementary schools and campgrounds, contains what are now considered to be potentially hazardous levels of PFAS, or toxic forever chemicals, linked to a slew of health problems linked to data from 2020. To explore a little bit more about what PFASs are, PFAS covers a broad range of chemical compounds widely used for their oil and water repellent characteristics. They're used in things like carpets, cosmetics, furniture, clothes, adhesives, sealants, cookware, firefighting foams, and so much more. They then leach into the water and food sources where they're eventually ingested by humans and stored in the body. Some of them have actually been shown to cause cancer. Now, according to an adjunct professor of environmental health at Harvard University, the research of this person showed that the chemicals can harm a person's antibody response, their metabolism, and their organ function. Which, of course, when we talk about climate disaster and climate crisis, we have to acknowledge that one of the potential outcomes is going to be further pandemics. So having a weakened immune system and a slower antibody response is not exactly going to be a good outcome if more pandemics occur and we are in fact ingesting these dangerous forever chemicals. They're also linked to things like obesity, high cholesterol, diabetes, more frequent and chronic infections, and higher hospitalization rates, particularly for pneumonia in children. And it's worth noting that children are especially vulnerable. As with a lot of the different things that we've seen across all of the different types of climate disasters, children often end up being the most vulnerable. Why? Because their bodies are not equipped to handle certain types of infections. They are not able to respond as well to not having the nutrients that they need. It can cause long-term effects. So a lot of these aspects of climate disaster leave children more vulnerable than adults. But Colorado is also plagued with the chemicals with more exposure sites than any other state in the United States. The EPA identified more than 120,000 places across the country where people might be exposed to chemicals, and Colorado topped the list with more than 21,000 sites. So this is something that we're seeing straight out of Colorado. And while these numbers are really scary, I think it is worth pausing at this point to note that a lot of other places may not be testing at the levels that Colorado currently is. They're at the top of this list, but they're also talking about it. There's reports discussing it being in the water supply. And a lot of places I'm really concerned are ignoring these things and are not testing at all. After all, if you don't test, you have no idea of how bad things actually are. And I'm actually glad that Colorado is doing what they're supposed to in testing their water supplies and everything that is going on here. But going back into the article here, We have not only should water officials in Colorado and the rest of the country ramp up testing efforts, but they should also invest in new ways to clean drinking water, pinpoint contamination sources, and cut out products that use the harmful compounds. Now, it's worth noting that there are a lot of companies like DuPont and like Dow Chemical who had been responsible historically for using a lot of these types of chemicals. And there are no real safe levels of any of this. PFAS, a broad chemical group containing thousands of different specific compounds, like I said, they're linked to cancer, birth defects, diabetes, autoimmune problems. And just recently, the EPA actually sharply reduced its health advisory levels for these chemicals only last month. Those levels are meant as a preliminary warning, while the EPA develops more formal and enforceable regulations for the compounds. Previously, we took the levels to be at about 70 parts per trillion. And on June 15th, the EPA lowered those levels to 0.004 parts per trillion or zero point 0 parts per trillion for different types of these chemicals. Now, these are practically undetectable levels, and 1 part per trillion is the equivalent of a single drop of chemical in 500,000 barrels of water. And we originally thought 70 parts per trillion was a safe amount, but over time, through more study and more understanding of what these chemicals are doing, we've learned that it's actually far more dangerous and that these levels had to be changed. Now, a round of state-funded PFAS tests in 2020 show that more than 100 public drinking water sources in Colorado have concentrations of the chemicals. Under the EPA's old standard of 70 parts per trillion, most of these sources fell well below the federal health advisory level. Under the EPA's new standard, however, none of them do. Which means that as we're learning more and as we're developing more and more information about these types of chemicals, we're realizing that what we thought was safe in fact wasn't, and a lot of places that we thought were relatively okay may in fact not be. And that's concerning going forward. But it's part of the process of trying to develop the science behind all of this and figure out just what these safe levels are. However, it should be fairly well understood that these things should have been tested well before they were put into people's water supplies or ended up in people's water supplies. After new rounds of water tests, providers who find contaminants must then clean their water. One method using granular activated charcoal can remove some of the compounds, but new ways are needed to clean the water of other types of chemicals, she said. In any case, cleaning or filtering the water takes time and money. Now, that's another major component of all this. Cleaning the water from these chemicals is going to be expensive, and it's probably going to be energy intensive. One of the best ways to deal with these types of chemicals, and some of the stuff we'll be talking about in a moment with microplastics, is to use techniques like reverse osmosis. However, when we use those types of techniques, they are very energy intensive, and that can cause other environmental problems, especially when we're still reliant on fossil fuels. So when we have these PFAS already being in the water supply and being dangerous enough, we're also finding that microplastics have found their way into the snowpack above Colorado. Now, this is the very same snowpack that will melt right into the water supply. So let's talk a little bit more about that now. So we have here that a retired U.S. Geological Survey researcher and his colleagues had suspected after seeing snowpack studies from faraway places that an invisible layer of microplastic blankets were in the Rocky Mountains, polluting the snowpack and water supply in undefined ways. Now on screen, this is a zoomed in section where that blue line represents 250 micrometers. And this is what we're seeing. These are the microplastics that we're talking about. This is 100 times magnification of dust on snow sample from Colorado's High County taken in May of 2016. So the fragments of shredded truck tires blown in from the nearby highways, pieces of plastic bottles lifted from a Utah landfill and dropped onto the Loveland Pass, and detritus from the Pacific garbage patch catapulted by El Nino into the San Juan Mountains. The microplastics on the slides are too tiny to offer identities like brand names or shapes, but those distant sources are the initial suspicions of the research team as they plan follow-up studies on more samples. So these are coming from all over the place and are ending up on the top of these snowpacks. One of the researchers had said, I think we're going to start seeing more and more microplastics in fish and in our drinking water. So again, this is worth noting that if it is in the snowpack, it will eventually end up in water supplies. It will also end up in waterways where fish are swimming. Fish will end up eating the microplastics just from the nature of swimming. It'll end up in their gills. And eventually, if we eat the fish, we're now eating and consuming microplastics. The microplastics also might be causing another issue, which is because of their tint, they may be absorbing sunshine and speeding up snowmelt. Now, one of the reasons that the west coast of the United States is going through the aridification that it is that high temperatures are causing snowpacks to melt way too early, which means that they're not able to build up enough water to refill the Colorado River. So if you have microplastics adding to this, in addition to the higher temperatures, we don't have the full research on this, but this might be another factor in why snowmelt is occurring at much more rapid rates. And if this is in fact the case, microplastics may in fact be part of the reason that drought conditions and aridification continue to happen in areas like the US West. Moving through this, though, we also find that the crew has been also seeing more and more disturbing articles about human-made impurities showing up in samples around the globe. So while we are focusing primarily on Colorado, again, this is happening globally. This is something that we're seeing quite consistently, and that's a disturbing trend. So much plastic is produced each year for everything from water bottles to clothing to industrial goods to packaging. And so little is recycled that it bumps and shreds and chips and blows and drifts everywhere. Plastics are fragmented, but never degraded, at least not in a time span relevant to life on this planet. It doesn't degrade like a lot of food products do. It ends up breaking down into these tiny fragments and stays for an extended period of time. The world produced over 348 million metric tons of plastic in 2017, and this number grows by about 5% every year. Of course, companies need their quarterly earnings, so they have to churn out more and more of the product in order for people to buy it and consume it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to keep up capitalism the way that it's going. A large proportion of this production accumulates as waste in the environment and progressive fragmentation. The microplastics end up in the wind and get spread across the globe. 11 billion metric tons of plastic are projected to accumulate in the environment by 2025. That is a lot of plastic waste that is breaking down into these tiny fragments that are ending up pretty much everywhere. Researchers have found that the airborne microplastics everywhere in the western United States, on Arctic ice floes, and high in the Pyrenees and Alps. It's happening across the globes. And as I've mentioned at the beginning of this whole video, recently microplastics have been identified in human blood and lung tissue. They're showing up in our bodies. This is becoming something way too normal, and it's disturbing. It's disturbing that we're seeing this as much as we are. Something needs to change very quickly, or else we're going to find out that generations down the line that, it's just going to be a standard procedure to find microplastics in newborn children. That we don't even know what the implications of such a thing would be. The microplastics, when they eventually fall from the snowpack. Now, when we talk about this, we have to recognize that it's going to end up in the mountain streams that wildlife then drink, swim in, and breed in. And some of it ends up in water supplies. So we have to ask some very important scientific questions about this. What happens to the animal bodies? Like, do animals process this any differently than we do? Is it dangerous to them? Could microplastic end up making them sick in a way that maybe we don't because of a difference in body weight? Upstream in the food chain, do tundra plants, for example, take on the microplastics through their roots? If you're absorbing water through your roots as a plant, does it change your growth? If the microplastics are present in the root system at that point, what happens when animals eat the plants that now contain microplastics? And then, of course, there's the downstream question, which Front Range cities pride themselves on basing their drinking water supplies on this snowmelt. And how much of the microplastic ends up in the water supply? How much does water treatment actually take out? And is it going to eventually cause harm to humans and or the systems where we treat our water? Now, research on the potential toxicity of these microplastics in water appears to be in its infancy. We still don't know the full extent of it, but I promise you it's probably not going to be good. That said, the World Health Organization has concluded that it's actually likely that humans have ingested plastic particles for decades as a result of widespread contact with plastics and household objects, including things like cutting boards, food packaging, and direct contamination in air and food. So we've already been exposed, and there's very little in the way of going back at the moment. And it's really scary because we don't know the long-term impacts on human life that this is going to have. It's just a big question mark. And the solutions seem scarce at the moment because we don't even fully understand the potential toxicity or how to resolve it. And again, a lot of the ways to solve this is extremely costly. And the fact is that we're realizing that there's less and less water across the globe that is not contaminated by either PFAS or microplastics at this point. Even if you want an alternative solution, you can't really find one. Tap water has it. Bottled water likely has leached plastic in it already. It's in our water supplies and the food chain. And we've been using these products so often in our daily lives and producing so much of it that likely none of us are exempt from these effects. The only solution that we have to filter out microplastics, like I said before, are things like reverse osmosis. And that's really energy intensive. And the reality is that nobody will want to fund this type of thing under capitalism unless they can turn a profit from it. Which means the only people who will ever benefit from it are the wealthiest people. Otherwise, nobody will want to spend the resources and capital to ensure people continue to have purely clean drinking water as the years go by. As we go forward, we're going to have to continue to find new ways to clean water and keep it safe for everyone. And that's going to drastically require us to change how we prioritize resources and develop new and better economic systems that prioritize human life over profit. That said, identifying this problem is the first step on a long road to even begin to try to resolve this. And for right now, there is no solution other than to continue to drink the water, to try to reduce how much damage we do it, and continue to try to protect this life-changing and life-saving gift that is our water supplies. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched here, consider liking the video, subscribing, leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord, where we have conversations on topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often become demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Terra, and I thank you for watching.